Good afternoon, everyone. I know that people are still joining us, but in the interest of time, I'm going to begin. My name is Deborah DeBruin. I direct the Center for Bioethics at the University of Minnesota, and I am really delighted to be able to host this special bioethics book event today with a longtime colleague and very dear friend, Dr. Steve Miles. Before we begin our discussion, let me just run through some logistical details for today. Next slide, please. So we encourage you to ask Dr. Miles questions about the novel that we're going to be talking about and the topic under consideration, which is holding physicians accountable for their complicity in torture. If you do have questions for Dr. Miles, please use the Q&A function to ask or to follow up on questions. You can also use the Q&A function to let center staff know if you're having technical difficulties during the webinar, and they will be able to respond privately to you. Please do not use the raise your hand function. We're not able to actually manage that for this particular webinar. The webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to access the recording at the web address that you see on the screen within a day or two after we are done today. We ask that you complete an evaluation to give us feedback on today's event. In order to make that very easy and convenient for you, we'll be giving you 3 ways to access that evaluation. First, it will pop up in your web browser when your Zoom window closes after the end of the event. Secondly, it is linked in a document that we call the presentation details document that center staff have posted in the chat. That document has a lot of information about today's event. You will also receive an email after the event with a link to complete the evaluation if that is the most convenient way for you to manage it. We do take your feedback very seriously from these evaluations on our events, and so I know it takes a little bit of time, but I do encourage you to fill out those evaluations if you're able to. Next slide, please. If you would like to request a certificate of attendance for continuing ed credits, please complete the form that's linked in the presentation details document, which will be posted, which it has already been posted in the chat. It can take a few days for us to process all of those certificates of attendance, so we ask that you please be patient. And I should note that based on accrediting agencies' requirements, you must attend a minimum of 75% of today's event in order to receive a certificate. I'd also like to note that there is information in the presentation details document about a very generous offer that Dr. Miles has made. He's offered to donate all the royalties from the purchase of this book for this seminar to the Center for Victims of Torture. You'll see some information about that in the presentation details document. So if you have purchased or plan to purchase a copy of the book, sort of connected to your attendance in the, at this webinar, there's an email address where you can just let center staff know that, so that Dr. Miles knows how to calculate the royalties that should go in that donation. I should note that the Center for Bioethics doesn't profit from sales of this book, and you, of course, do not need to purchase the book in order to attend the webinar. Next slide, please. So now it is my absolute delight to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Miles, who is Professor Emeritus at the Center for Bioethics and the Department of Medicine at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Miles is an internationally recognized expert on physicians who torture for their governments. This is an issue that he's been working on for almost 20 years now, right, Steve? Among his many honors is the Lifetime Achievement Award of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. I could go on and on about Dr. Miles's achievements and his many honors, but in the interest of letting you hear from him, I will stop now. There is a link to his longer bio in that presentation details document, and I encourage you to review it if you're not already familiar with his work. And at this point, let's start talking about the book. So Steve, welcome very much. I would really like to welcome you and thank you very much for coming and talking to us about your novel today. And I wonder if you could just begin by giving people a little bit of a background about the story in the novel.
Well, the story is about an effort to bring a doctor to criminal trial. These are pretty rare, actually, probably a total of maybe 30 or 40 in the world, despite the fact that doctors are routinely embedded as part of the infrastructure of torture in manners described in this book around the world. So of the tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of doctors who've been complicit with torture, it's extremely rare to have one go to trial.
Thanks. And I wonder if you could tell us, I mean, obviously you have had a long career of writing scholarly work in bioethics. And as I mentioned, almost 20 years of that career devoted to work on this particular topic. So why fiction at this point? Why did you decide to write a novel as opposed to another scholarly book?
I retired in that, number one. And I promised my mother that I would never write another footnote. And so that was part of it. And so I decided that when COVID closed everything, I love to travel. And all of a sudden I was retired and grounded, which was kind of a really bad thing. And so I decided to summarize what I knew about this topic for a different audience rather than academic books. And also, there's a fair amount of secondary torture or secondary trauma dealing with this subject. And so I had a lot of issues to put to rest too. And so I decided to tell the story of the topic, but do so in a novel form.
And what do you think you were able to do, or well, yeah, let me put the question that broadly. What do you think you were able to do as an author within the fictional world that would have been difficult if you had been writing another scholarly text, besides avoiding those footnotes?
Yeah, well, I think one thing you can do is scholarly works in bioethics tend to be heavily principle driven. But principles really aren't how we live. If your mom says come home for Thanksgiving, like, autonomy really isn't the driving force. Okay, there are relationships there, obligations, competing relationships even. And so one of the things that this did was it gave me a chance to kind of tease out how the relationships fit in with both the process of making a torturer, in the case of Dr. Añoro, but also in the context of making the people who go after them, and showing how those confluences of circumstances and luck and opportunity and collateral pressures actually were moving these people, not simply disembodied principles.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So what role, you've already sort of started to talk about this, but what role do you think that fiction can play in general in illuminating problems in bioethics? So partly it's a matter of not having it just be sort of a principlist,
No.
rationalistic kind of analysis. You get to take so much more, like you're saying, relationships and so on into account. I wonder if there are other features of fiction or other sort of experiences that you have had with fiction that has really cast some light on bioethics issues.
Well, fiction's really interesting because there are studies of the effect of fiction on readers. And what they do is they communicate different realities and they foster empathy. For example, Uncle Tom's Cabin in the United States just before the Civil War, although now it's regarded as quaint and vaguely stereotypic racism. On the other hand, the character was real and he was human, and people saw a Black person as a full human being. And this type of cross-cultural, cross-gender, cross-class empathy building is one of the major features of fiction. Now, another thing that's been studied is what happens to clinicians when they're exposed to novels. And it's been shown that the quality of their relationships and the content of their communication with patients actually improves because it gives them access to a sense of a more textured reality. And some people argue, for example, Steven Pinker and others have argued that fiction has actually been extraordinarily influential in the entire human rights experience of the last, since the Enlightenment, because it has literally opened up dialogues where social boundaries had prevented them from being crossed, and that it has created a type of cross-cultural understanding, empathy, and comprehension that just did not exist before.
I think this is really interesting because as you were talking, and maybe this is the philosopher in me, but there was something very meta going on. That is to say, in my head, you were talking about how fiction can give voice to people and through that build empathy. And I think it's interesting that that same sort of strategy, if I can use that term, gets used in the storyline, right? When the legal team in the grand jury hearing that you focus on in the book use narratives from victims rather than rather than describing themselves or using in more legalistic language about what happened. They try to sort of put forth narratives in an attempt, I think, to do very much the same thing, right? Build empathy, give voice to those people who are victims.
Yeah, well, part of it, I didn't want to traumatize the reader by taking them into torture cells, which I just don't do torture porn. But on the other hand, each of those affidavits by the witnesses was said some witness testimony to the reader as well as to the grand jury about this is what I experienced either in the prison or in losing my son. And so by using the first person for the court narratives rather than selecting the raw reports, and there was a discussion of that choice early in the book, I think it does help humanize the victims, because one of the ways that torture works and is tolerated is that the victims are dehumanized to the point where we can't empathize with their suffering.
Yeah. So let me pause for a second here and just encourage folks to type their questions into the Q&A function. Just a reminder that you can do that. One question, another question for you, Steve, on the sort of fact versus fiction theme, the role of fiction, which is how much of the book is true. So I know it's recent historic fiction, but how much of it would you say is true?
Well, 95%.
So it's very accurate is what you're saying.
I mean, for example, you can do a deep dive. There was a torturer in Brazil whose real name happened to be Lobo, and he wrote his autobiography, and it was called "The Hour of the Wolf and the Hour of the Sheep." Well, I thought that was pretty interesting that he would go and pun, and so that little ditty that Ennio built up to torture people was directly taken from that. The Council of Godmothers is real. Sophie Scholl, the woman executed during the Nazis' time, she was real. The UN head was actually modeled after a guy in the UN that I really worked with. All of the affidavits were taken from real life. I didn't make up any instance of torture. Now, obviously, there are fictional constructs in there. Heloise and Sophie are obvious fictions, and so is Agnoro, but the construction is entirely built out of fact.
Okay. We have an audience member asking in the Q&A, is this your first novel? And did you have people preview chapters of the completed manuscript before you published it?
Yeah, it was a nightmare. First, I had some friends look at it. I hired 2 consultants, and they did it, and finally got done with that and tried. Copy editing would have been extraordinarily expensive. You got to understand the economics. I sent it to 25 agents. They all said no. And so basically copy editing would have cost me on the order of $20,000. So I did that the best I could, but it's rough.
And the answer to the is this your first novel question is yes, correct?
Yeah, I mean, other than lying all the time.
So another audience member thanks you for being here and says that they're interested to hear more, or at least as much as you are willing to share, about the secondary trauma that you mentioned. She says, in my work in humanitarian aid, I see this a lot, but it's very hard for people to talk about or admit to, especially those of us who work in countries and are guests bearing witness to atrocities. Can you speak a little bit about how you or others you've worked with have managed to bring that into words?
Well, first off, one has to admit it, otherwise one quickly goes dysfunctional. Same goes for hospice workers, for example. Lately, we've seen a huge recognition of the problem of PTSD in police officers that non-dealt with spirals into a casualization of violence among some in the police force. I had my first experience with it was when I worked in a refugee camp in a war zone on the Thai-Cambodian border, and did not deal with it over there, and dealt with it when I got back, which was not the way to do it. When I went later, I went to the tsunami zone in Indonesia and worked in a town which had lost 250,000 people overnight. And by then I knew that you could get a better experience if you decompress in another part of the same culture, so you can see how the people live and love in normal life. So I went to a suburb of Jakarta and hung out, drank beer, had coffee, watched the street go by, and wrote notes. And it has to be recognized and has to be dealt with, because it is capable to have it turn into a form of PTSD, which is called secondary PTSD or secondary trauma syndrome. But on the other hand, I don't think that it's appropriate to, as a person who works here, to put that kind of trauma in front of the primary trauma of those people who are actually tortured.
So one of the audience members notes that The Leper's Furies, the novel, is set in Senegal. The doctor is from Sierra Leone, right? But the question is, and that's where the torture took place, in Sierra Leone. The hearing is taking place in Senegal. The question from the audience member is, could this have taken place elsewhere?
Well, about 150, 170 countries are known to have tortured. Rich countries and poor countries, democracies and fascist states. The United States had a well-organized torture system during the War on Terror. Spain tortured, actually still tortures. Italy has a pretty good accountability system. So yeah, this is a common experience. And then on top of that, within that 140 or 50 countries, in another book, which is nonfiction, what I found in studying those was that doctors are basically built into the entire system of torture around the world. That is, all torture systems around the world use doctors to falsify medical records, to keep people alive who are supposed to be kept alive, or to design torture methods that don't leave scars, which can be used as evidence.
So yeah, I was going to ask you if you would be willing to comment a little bit on I know there's a diversity of ways that physicians are complicit in abetting torture. And you've spoken a little bit about that just now. Is that fairly consistent across in your experience in studying this topic, fairly consistent across those settings? And are there other things you want to say about that, about the ways in which docs are complicit in abetting torture?
It's an interesting question. First off, there is no science of torture, okay? There's no science. And so what happens is people develop local folkways that spread by various means across borders, such as electricity, or they develop local methods such as gasoline enemas that get concentrated in a particular area in Northwest India. So essentially it's passed by folkways, it's passed by imagination, it's passed by commanders. And then there are occasionally these weird local variants. For example, Argentina was the place that really pioneered the use of stealing the babies that were newborn in prisons and then giving them false birth certificates, and then so that they appeared to be the living offspring of prison or military officials. And incidentally, the current Pope was part of hiding those, the baptismal certificates for those kids from human rights workers, so that family reunification was not possible until 15, 20 years after the birth certificate or baptismal certificates were only released about 5-6 years ago.
So there is a point late in the novel, where Sophie, who is the lead attorney for the grand jury hearing, she says one conclusion was inescapable: the medical profession was part of the machinery of torture, by which she clearly does not mean individual docs.
No.
And I wonder if you'd be, I mean, as long as we're sort of expanding on this sort of theme, I wonder if you would be willing to comment on that idea about the complicity of the profession.
Yeah, I think, for example, the American Medical Association and the licensing boards in the United States did not hold any of the doctors or psychologists accountable for the acts that they committed during the War on Terror. I alluded to the fact that Sierra Leone did not, and that is a true statement, does not have any code barring physicians from torture, even though those codes are readily available in international templates. Argentina, for example, no doc was punished by any medical board. They were only punished by courts. In other countries, the Medical Association has done a bit better. For example, Uruguay delicensed, I think, about 15 docs. So it varies a lot, but as a whole, given the universal practice of using docs for torture, the accountability of docs to medical licensing boards or to the World Medical Association, which allows countries to be members who do not hold docs accountable without comment, is an example of the institutional accountability to the profession of medicine, which is part of the infrastructure of torture.
So we have an audience member who asks, aside from being an obedient son and acceding to your mother's request to do no more footnotes, no, that promised, I'm not going to do any more footnotes. Were you concerned that the historic fiction approach changes the story in ways that doesn't honor the true stories of the victims?
I think that is a great question, and I definitely want it to be true to the real experience. And that is why embedded truth in all of the witness statements that were brought before the court. I did not make any material changes in those except to bring them all to Sierra Leone, and stated that they could have been elsewhere. But I think that on the one hand, for example, the witness literature has been enormously potent with regard to bring forth the story of torture. And on the other hand, the question of respecting the confidentiality of witnesses has also been important. And in all the instances that I included in the book, except one, the witnesses had been vetted by International Human Rights Organization and remained confidential. In the one case where the witness or where the person had been named, I didn't add the name. It was Dr. Parandajami in Iran, who was mysteriously died of a heart attack on about his 7th day after giving parliamentary testimony, and then was buried under a heliport, so he couldn't get an autopsy. That was a true story, and I think, but I think that I owed a lot of respect to the actual experiences, and that's why I used them rather than a novel that involved inventing them, like, say, for example, Clockwork Orange.
So another of our participants wonders if you would comment about whether the sort of the word in the question is mentality, whether the thought process or the approach that somehow allows physicians to commit torture also explains more benign types of physician misbehavior. Do you think that there's a ripple effect here?
I basically, I don't want to go there because one of the things I did talk about was how Yoda was groomed for his job. Okay. He went into the service out of a particular financial need, but then they groomed him in. They said, well, could you just say that certify that these people are homosexual because we can damage the potential career of these dissidents by doing so. And so he signed those things. And then he was worked up to giving some drugs that would cause suffering. And then he moved progressively deeper into it. That's all true. Okay. Unlike soldiers, he was not brought into torture by being beaten himself, which is more common for low rank soldiers. So the problem of lack of empathy in physicians is well known. The problem of political conservatism in physicians is well known. And to that extent, torture tends to be associated with authoritarian views and a lack of empathy. And it tends to particularly emerge in authoritarian cultures. And interestingly, the docs then, as a class, their interests coincide with that of the regime. And then as the regime weakens, as it tortures civil society in part of maintaining control, the docs then move to more tightly affiliate with civil society. And at that point, some doctors then become witnesses, expert witnesses, to identify torture and to initiate the process of accountability. So the doctors are not simply responsible as torturers, they're also responsible in holding other doctors accountable.
That's interesting. One of our participants wonders about other members of healthcare teams, other healthcare workers like nurses, and whether they're potentially complicit in torture as well.
Yes.
And if so, whether they're somehow protected or shielded from accountability or the burden of making decisions because they have essentially less power than docs do.
Generally, accountability in torture proceeds from national leaders to senior officers, and doctors generally have ranks, so they're the third most likely. Nurses don't have serious rank generally and are well protected. There are maybe 4 or 5 cases of nurses being held accountable. Now, keep in mind that my definition of torture is the international law definition, which said that torture is an intention to inflict pain when done by a person acting in the course of their official duties. So none of this applies to, for example, the sadist who locks somebody in their basement and tortures them. That's not a national act.
And what prompted you to start working on docs complicity and torture? One of our audience members is wondering what brought you to this work.
Well,
Some 20 years ago, Steve.
Yeah. Well, a long time ago, there was this prison called Abu Ghraib in Iraq, and pictures came out of it showing guards torturing prisoners. And so I was interested in finding out, how did the military suppress the protests of docs? And so the ACLU was running Freedom of Information Act requests, and everybody was taking their little piece of it, like the White House lawyers and, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld stuff. The documents were a mess because what the government did was it's blacked out pieces, and then it photocopied them, and then it turned the photocopies into PDFs so that the documents couldn't be searched. They had to be read. Over a long period of time, about 2 years, I think I read 60,000 pages and indexed them, and then wrote a book and a bunch of articles on describing the fact that the docs protest was never there. In fact, the docs were built in to the system of torture. And then, to be fair, meanwhile, I was running an international literature search on docs of torture. And then since basically I wound up with a decade's worth of automatic literature searches on the topic from newspapers and stuff. And so I was able to put together a global map of torture, and that showed that the US system was essentially identical to the one in other countries.
I remember when those photos from Abu Ghraib came out, having a conversation with you in the center front office, in which you said to me, there are all these discussions about what's happening in Abu Ghraib, but where are the docs? There's nobody is saying anything about docs.
Yeah.
And then you just sort of took off and started trying to figure out what was going on. I remember, and it was a very deep rabbit hole. I think it was a very long journey to get you to this point. But ended up meaning, I mean, I said at the beginning, you're an internationally recognized expert on this. I mean, very well deserved. Internationally recognized expert, international recognition, because you have done an enormous amount of very careful, diligent work on these topics.
A lot of footnotes.
A lot of footnotes.
But I mean, for example, the argument was, when I started this, a lawyer can look at a birth or a death certificate, but a lawyer sees what's on the death certificate. They don't understand what should be there.
Yeah.
They can miss the omissions. Okay. And so I started finding altered death certificates. I started finding, curious, here's a set of death certificates, 28 death certificates, with all of them let's see, the most common cause of death was heart attack of people in the mid-20s. Huh? What does that mean?
Yeah.
Oh.
One of our participants wants to know, I mean, you mentioned that some countries are way better than others of, taking a stand against torture. And this person wants to know, what are the elements of a robust anti-torture system? And aside from Italy, who you mentioned a little bit ago, who else does it well, would you say?
Italy does it well. I think the general elements here are, you have to have a robust civil society, a sense that we have empathy with each other in order to do this, and those countries are less likely to have torture altogether. And Scandinavian countries, for example. And also, it's my impression that very small countries are less likely to have torture, because it's very hard to do this in a way that doesn't cause massive immigration of brain drain. And so that's why the countries have to secure, for example, the voluntary participation of people. That you can't force your docs to torture, because if you've only got one doc per 3,000 people, small immigration of doctors itself is destabilizing to the regime. And so these countries, they have a civil society that's stronger than the government's autocratic rule. They also and I think this is really interesting. You remember what TV show was extraordinarily popular in the United States when they were doing Abu Ghraib, or when they were doing torture in the War on Terror?
What?
That one about, what was a guy called 24 or whatever, guy who tortured for a job. I
Oh,
forget. Okay.
yeah.
You need a national indoctrination, essentially, to say that torture works at keeping out the radicals and the no-goods. And the degree of violence in torture countries' media is really extraordinary.
I think that leads in well to, one of the next questions, which is, can you comment on the role media plays that may give support to physician involvement? So this questioner says, an example is the film Zero Dark 30, which implies that Osama bin Laden was found through intel gained through waterboarding, when in fact he was found through spying and bribery. A comment on that, and then we can talk about media more broadly.
Yeah, I think, well, first off, the person who wrote that was correct. That's how he was found. But also in Zero Dark 30, they censored out, that is, they did not depict the role of doctors in overseeing torture. Okay, it was all done by soldiers, and so there was this attempt to split off the medical profession, and indeed the regimes do make a promise to the docs that you will not be held accountable. And Zero Dark 30 did not hold the docs accountable. Okay. Now, in terms of the torture, which they alleged was led to that information, there was a guy who was tortured that they tried to say supplied the information. And one of the ways he was tortured was had been shot in the course of being arrested. And Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld specifically ordered no pain medicine for him until he told where bin Laden was. In fact, the guy gave bad information about plots and locations that then got wove into the film as saying he told where the truth. He didn't. And it was thoroughly medicalized torture.
So this connects, I think, to broader conversations about the role of the media. And there's a point late in the novel where Sophie, who, again, for those of you who haven't yet read the novel, is the lead attorney in the grand jury hearing. After the hearing is over, she's back home and she's watching a movie in which soldiers beat a prisoner. And she thinks, and this is a quote from the novel, the fact that torture was such a common part of popular entertainment meant that audiences did not feel its pain, saw it as a necessary reality, and were not inclined to abolish it. And that's the end of that quote. I wonder if you could comment on that in general. I mean, the role of the media, the role of entertainment, what that does to us as a culture and the pursuit of justice around torture.
Well, I think it's coarsening, and it also normalizes torture. For example, if you take the issue of rape, we have a country that has basically made rape a staple of our entertainment system, which basically normalizes it, minimizes the harm to people, and desensitizes us to the lack of accountability and the long-term effects on people who are raped. Now, we do the same for torture. It is torture by police, by various military governments, ours and others, is basically standard form of entertainment. And interestingly, it's within the context of a very simplistic drama, that the world is divided into good and bad, and that the good have to go bad in order to deal with the bad, which is simply not how it works in life.
So I wonder to what extent the legal proceedings in this case, that grand jury hearing, was inspired by your scholarly work or your expert testimony in other cases, because I know you've given expert testimony, correct, in torture cases. So how similar is the hearing in the book to cases that you've been involved in?
Very similar. I had to construct a simple hearing just because I didn't want to write a legal procedural. So I wanted something where I had a little flexibility with the rules, something where I could take a lift off of the legal procedures and focus on the evidence and the characters. But if there is a legal procedure for this, it is close to a hearing venue that is in Sierra Leone, and it's also somewhat similar to some of the informal court mechanisms, for example, in Rwanda, that have been used to hold torturers accountable. And then you notice that there was a ride along of the Sierra Leone Medical Council, which did absolutely nothing.
Right, right, yeah. So I want to zone in on Dr. Agnoto, if we can, for a few minutes. He is the doc who's accused of participating in torture in the novel. And a couple of passages from him are really striking, I think, and I want to read them and then ask you to comment. The first is early in the novel, wherein he's in detention awaiting the hearing, and he says, quote, "There's nothing unusual in my story. There are a lot of guys like me. I am not the worst. I can't figure it out. Who is targeting me? I don't understand why I'm here." And that's the end of the quote. Is he right that there's nothing that really sets him apart from others? Do you want to comment a little bit for me on that, his consternation at feeling like so many people do so many worse things than he does, and so why choose him to try?
One of the things that is universal or nearly universal in torturers is they have contempt for human rights law. And the second thing is that they are almost always, they are always symbolic cases that are pursued for symbolic reasons. For example, the Biko case in South Africa. Well, that's a big story. But anyway, so in a sense, he was singled out. He was certainly not the only person in Sierra Leone at that time. But also, it shows his lack of empathy for the magnitude of what he did, because the question wasn't why he was singled out, but what did he do to deserve being singled out, which is the real case. And even in his final interview with his former commanding officer, he said, really, the human rights people did this, and that wasn't the issue. So there's that.
Yeah, there's that. So there's another, excuse me, another passage a little bit later in the book. This is a little longer, but I'll read it, where he says, and again, this is a quote, "Somewhere during my career, I became silent. My fellow soldiers' volleys of curses were just grunts. I know that they heard my words as the same. It was an article of faith that prisoners never spoke a true word. An interrogation was like watching a witch scream into a mirror. What's the fairest of them all? The prisoners would scream, "Our leader," or "My loyalty," whatever it took for the abuse to end. But the interrogators neither sought nor expected truth. The slightest shard of truth only incited them to greater fury, until every fact drowned in pain and screams. A world without truth, a language without content, has room for only one emotion: contempt. Contempt for the prisoners, for colleagues, and for language itself. In such a world, there is no reason to speak at all. End quote. There's a lot going on in that passage, sir. Would you care to comment on that for us?
Yeah, well, let me just give the basics. It's been well documented by numerous research that torture does not elicit truth, period. And in fact, prisoners become resistant to telling the truth the instant the torture starts. And so that's just the fact. So then the question is, well, why does the torturing society pursue torturing if it's non-productive of the truth, which is allegedly the name of the game? And the fact is that torture is conducted for revenge, it's conducted for political suppression, it's conducted to hold the regime in power, but truth has nothing to do with it. And for the regime in power, they don't care about truth anyway. And so torturing can be done because truth is
relevant. So that I think connects up to that previous question about the media that we had. It also, I think, connects to a lot of the conversation in scholarly circles about torture, where there is, as you know well, this debate about whether torture is ever justifiable, and it's that debate always really focuses on that utilitarian argument that says, oh, but if there's really critical information that you really must have to promote national security or save people's lives, then in those circumstances, if you weigh and balance out the values involved, the torture has to be allowable. Essentially what you're saying, as I understand it, is that utilitarian argument, we don't even really need to, it's irrelevant, because it's never true that we get good information from torture.
It is irrelevant for a couple of reasons. First off, it ignores how many innocent people you have to torture to get that shard of truth you're looking for. If, for example, I could torture a prisoner's baby in order to get the information out of the prisoner, would that be acceptable? If I could torture an entire room of 1,000 people to find one fact, would that be acceptable? Second, intelligence doesn't operate in the form of the ticket time bomb, just doesn't do that. And the third thing about the utilitarian argument that is wrong, and for example, the American Psychological Association barred in its committee that was setting up a torture policy for the Department of Defense, looking at the empirical data showing that torture, coercive interrogation, or torture did not work. And so the argument shifted entirely to the utilitarian hypothetical, which was designed to justify torture, and ignored the data showing that it didn't work.
So another sort of apology or excuse or rationale that people often give for torture, I think, gets explored later in the book when we get a brief appearance of Dr. Agnoto's wife, who says, quote, "I believe that Fode, Agnoto's name, or his Fodo Agnoto, was ordered to do these terrible things. He could not stand up to such powerful people. He got blamed." It's striking to me that that commentary from her suggests that she believed the evidence that was presented at the hearing, right? But she excuses him anyway. And a couple of questions here. How common is that attitude about just following orders? That's an excuse. And then I have a feeling I know what you're going to say here, but would you care to comment on how reasonable or a justification for torture that is?
Well, I mean, even in Nazi Germany, I believe there are only 3 docs who were known to be ordered. There were a couple in Iraq, but generally it's against the regime's interest to compel docs to torture because many of these countries are doc poor and they can't afford the brain drain, which itself is politically destabilizing. Or the fact is that docs have international relationships, and if you compel them to do something, they are well situated to leak to the international human rights community. And so the regimes don't compel docs. In fact, what they do is they perk them in. They give them high ranks, they give them high salaries, and they incent them in, and then they capture them by making them complicit. And then the doc is basically captured within a zone of complicity rather than in a zone of coercion.
It's really interesting. So we're almost out of time, but I have just a few more questions I want to ask, at least a couple more, to try to move us to, you know, what can be done essentially. So there's a point in the novel where Sophie's supervisor at the UN talks about how important the case is as part of the torture abolition movement. And I'm wondering, given that we're close to the end, if you could comment a little bit on the role of those sorts of legal proceedings, but then also sort of an extrajudicial kind of response to torture. Talk about the Godmother's Councils too.
The what?
The Godmother's Councils.
Oh yeah, the Godmother's Councils are real. I've worked with them in Africa. They're pretty cool. And we're using them for CBT is also using them in the Congo. I've never seen that group before, but I worked with them in Sudan. The real issue here, I think, in torture, people tend to look at this as the outcome of an individual case. This is a civil rights movement. It's part of the larger human rights movement. It took, nearly 2,000 years of evolution from the conception of no slavery in Greece to eliminating slavery in the mid 18th century. And even now we have scattered spots of slavery, but it's clearly, much less than it ever was. 200 years ago, 2/3 of the world's population was in debt, peonage, or slavery, 2/3. Women got the right to vote from about 100 years ago in this country. And I think that we should look at torture abolition in the same way. Now, that means we have to say it's a real goal. We can't say that it's inherent in human nature. We can't say that it's simply an accepted norm. We have to say it's unacceptable. And we have to say that there will be accountability. And the United States, when it said that the Geneva Accords don't apply to the war on terror, was welcomed by dictators around the world as saying, thank God we're done with those pesky international laws. And they basically took it as the end of international law. And we have to join the Rome Court now in order to undo the damage we did by torturing without accountability.
So one last question real quick, and this is something our audience always wants to know at our webinars. What can we do? Is there something that we can do to assist in that torture abolition movement?
Yeah, I think you should not patronize media that features rape, torture, and assault as a form of entertainment, as a way, as a way of moving yourself from thinking that this is normal, excusable, or inevitable behavior. And in that way, you can withdraw from a culture that's basically based on assault and the political consequences that will follow.
Okay, thank you. I just want to thank you so much for joining us today and talking to us about your work, both your scholarly work and the novel, which I do really encourage folks to read. It's
I'd be grateful for Amazon blurbs.
So thank you again. And this is our last webinar of this academic year, but stay tuned. You'll be hearing from us with information about the events for next fall. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and hearty thanks to Center for Bioethics staff, without whom these webinars would absolutely not be possible. So thanks all, and we'll see you next fall.